Imagine a wedding night that ends in a chilling mystery no one can explain. What would you do if the couple never woke up? Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and let's see who's joining me as we uncover the story. The late afternoon sun slanted across the cracked stucco of the old Ventura estate, casting long, uneven shadows over the courtyard where ivy clung desperately to the walls. The air, tinged with the scent of orange blossoms from the distant orchards, carried a peculiar stillness, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Inside, the grand hall remained silent, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the outside world, and the ancient chandelier above flickered faintly, despite the absence of any breeze. It was a house that remembered its own past, and tonight, the memory seemed almost alive, vibrating through the wooden floorboards and the dust-laden portraits that lined the walls. In one of the upper rooms, Eleanor and Victor Montgomery prepared for what should have been the happiest night of their lives. The siblings, only months apart in age, shared an uncanny resemblance, so much so that strangers often hesitated when introduced to them, their minds momentarily unmoored by the mirrored faces. Their mother, long past, had once whispered of a family curse, a story murmured in the candlelight, a warning never taken seriously until now. But Eleanor, brushing a strand of dark hair from her forehead, did not think of curses as she adjusted the lace of her gown. She thought only of the ritual, the vows, the night that should have promised joy. Victor, in the room next door, adjusted his tuxedo in the tarnished mirror, his reflection fragmented by cracks in the glass. There was a nervous energy in his movements, a tremor beneath the veneer of control. He had long felt the estate's gaze, the way the ceilings seemed to sag under unseen weight, how shadows pooled and lingered where they had no right to be. Yet tonight, there was a sense of inevitability, an unspoken understanding between them that tonight would change everything, though not in ways either could imagine. The servants moved like ghosts, silent and precise, setting the table in the dining hall where the reception would never be held. Outside, the California wind whispered through the olive trees, carrying the faint sound of a bell tolling somewhere far beyond the estate's boundaries. It was as if the world itself were marking the hour, though no clock in the house made a sound. Candles were lit, their flames small but obstinate, flickering in response to something unseen. Eleanor paused at the threshold, hand hovering over the doorknob, sensing a heaviness pressing against her chest. Victor's voice called from below, warm and familiar, yet somehow distant, and she felt a shiver creep along her spine. The dinner had been modest, though elegant, and the champagne flowed freely, its bubbles sparkling like trapped sunlight in the crystal flutes. Guests, mostly distant relatives and a handful of family friends, spoke in hushed tones, the laughter polite but strained. Each seemed to glance at the siblings with a mixture of awe and unease, as if expecting, though hoping against reason, that something might intervene and halt the proceedings. Yet no one spoke of the stories that lingered like cobwebs in the corners, tales of the previous generation, of weddings that ended in tragedy, of whispered warnings ignored, and of the house that seemed to feed on anticipation. The ceremony itself had been intimate. The local minister, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, had muttered blessings that felt hollow against the oppressive stillness. The vows were exchanged, words flowing like a river that would soon run dry, and rings slipped onto trembling fingers. Eleanor's eyes glimmered with unshed tears, and Victor's lips quivered, not with joy but with something heavier, darker, an instinctive knowledge of what was to come. When the minister pronounced them bound in matrimony, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against the lungs, and the flicker of the chandelier cast long shadows that stretched across the polished floors, reaching out toward them. The estate seemed to exhale then, slowly, as though satisfied that the ritual had been completed. But satisfaction was not a benign thing in the Montgomery house. The walls whispered in tongues long forgotten, and the portraits of ancestors seemed to tilt in silent acknowledgement, their painted eyes gleaming with something alive. The siblings, hand in hand, descended the staircase, their faces pale beneath the soft lamplight, unaware that the first tremors of the night's horror had already begun. Dinner had concluded without incident, yet the unease grew in the empty spaces between conversations. The servants had retreated to the kitchens and the servants' quarters, leaving the siblings momentarily alone. Victor suggested a walk in the garden to clear their heads, and Eleanor agreed, though a subtle dread curled in her stomach. They stepped outside, the gravel crunching beneath their polished shoes, the air heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The moon hung low, a pale sentinel in the indigo sky, and shadows from the gnarled olive trees seemed to slither across the manicured paths, reaching out as if to touch, to warn, or perhaps to claim. They paused by the fountain at the garden's center, its water motionless in the still night. Victor took Eleanor's hand, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath again. Then came the first sound, a faint, almost imperceptible creak from the house, as though a door, long sealed, had been nudged open. Eleanor froze, her pulse quickening, and Victor's brow furrowed. The wind shifted, carrying with it a whisper of laughter, soft, cruel, and unrecognizable. Neither moved, the air around them thickening with tension, charged as though the earth itself were aware of the impending calamity. The first scream came suddenly, piercing and shrill, echoing through the corridors of the estate. It was not one voice but a chorus, a layering of cries from some impossible distance and yet intimately close. Guests ran from their rooms, servants returned in a flurry, and the night erupted in chaos. But the siblings, Eleanor and Victor, stood rooted near the fountain, as if bound by some invisible force. Their eyes met, wide and uncomprehending, and then, as though the house itself had decided, they fell, together at once, their bodies collapsing into the cold stone beneath the fountain's edge. The echo of their deaths resonated through the mansion, lingering in the air like a dense fog. No one could explain what had happened, and when the authorities arrived the following morning, they found the house silent, the siblings' bodies cold and unclaimed. Rumors began immediately, whispers of curses, of ancestral wrongs, of a house that did not forgive. Yet no one dared stay long enough to uncover the truth. The Montgomery estate remained, looming over the valley like a dark sentinel, its windows reflecting the morning sun as though nothing had transpired, and yet, in its shadows, something eternal and terrible waited. The morning after the tragedy, Ventura's town square seemed almost surreal. News of the Montgomery siblings' deaths had spread like wildfire through the small California community, and yet the sunlight fell on the storefronts and the courthouse with the same casual indifference it always had. Shopkeepers paused in their work to murmur among themselves, hands trembling as they clutched ledger books and coffee cups, glancing toward the distant estate atop the hill. No one had seen Eleanor and Victor alive after sunset, and the circumstances of their demise defied comprehension. Sheriff Amos Hargrove, a man of broad shoulders and a perpetually furrowed brow, rode his horse up the winding drive to the estate that morning. He had been a deputy in Ventura for more than a decade, and though he had seen his share of accidents and violence, nothing prepared him for the sight that greeted him at the gates. The Montgomery house loomed like a fortress, its stucco walls warm with the glow of sunrise, yet its shadows pooled deep and black where the light could not reach. The gate swung slightly in the wind, squealing on rusted hinges, and Hargrove dismounted, gripping the reins tightly, his boots crunching over the gravel path. Inside, the mansion was an eerie tableau of disorder restrained. The dining hall remained set as if anticipating the siblings' return, plates and silverware untouched, the remnants of champagne glinting faintly in crystal flutes. The hall itself was suffused with a strange chill, and the air carried a faint metallic tang that made Hargrove wrinkle his nose. Servants, pale and shaken, huddled in the corner, their eyes wide, their whispers barely audible. They spoke of screams in the night, shadows moving independently of their sources, and of the fountain in the garden, where the siblings' bodies had been found, hands clasped, eyes wide in frozen terror. Hargrove approached the fountain slowly, circling its marble edge. The water was still, almost oily in its reflection, and the two bodies lay as though sculpted by some cruel artist. He knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, and noted the absence of marks, bruises, or signs of struggle. There was no evidence of poison, no weapons, no blood beyond what seeped naturally from the siblings' forms. The sheriff frowned, his mind unwilling to settle on a rational explanation. He had learned long ago that some things in life could not be reasoned away, and this seemed one of them. By mid-morning, reporters had arrived, filing articles that teetered between incredulity and sensationalism. Headlines screamed of the Montgomery curse and tragedy at the Ventura estate, though none could convey the atmosphere that lingered in the halls. A few local physicians had been summoned, examining the bodies with detached professionalism, yet leaving with the same questions the sheriff carried. Dr. Leland, an older man with thin spectacles, muttered darkly as he stepped from the garden. "I have seen death in many forms, Amos, but never so complete. Neither disease nor malady accounts for this." Rumors began almost immediately among the townsfolk. Some spoke of the estate's history, how the Montgomery line had been steeped in secrecy, intermarriage, and whispered misdeeds. Others mentioned a series of marriages long ago that had ended in premature deaths, each incident more peculiar than the last. The siblings themselves, both in their 20s, had been the latest in a chain of tragedies that no one alive could fully explain. And though the town whispered, they dared not enter the estate. The place had taken on a reputation that felt almost sentient, a malign presence that weighed upon the air. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a journalist named Clara Winslow had taken an interest in the case. Clara was not a woman easily intimidated by superstition or fear. Her column had exposed scandals in the city's high society, and she approached the Montgomery story with a professional curiosity that bordered on obsession. Arriving at Ventura in the early afternoon, she was struck immediately by the contrast, the estate gleaming under the sun, yet emanating an unmistakable aura of dread. She wandered the perimeter, notebook in hand, sketching the layout of the house, noting the garden paths, the fountain, and the way shadows pooled in unnatural patterns. As she worked, a local gardener approached her cautiously. He introduced himself as Manuel, his hands calloused, his eyes wary. "Miss, you should not linger too long," he said. "There are things in that house, things that do not die with the dead." Clara's curiosity sharpened. She pressed for details, and Manuel recounted stories he had overheard from generations of servants. Whispers of the house's appetite for misfortune, strange occurrences during past weddings, and the finality of death that seemed drawn to the Montgomery line like moths to a flame. Clara recorded every word, feeling a chill that had little to do with the Californian sun. As night approached, Ventura itself fell into a silence unusual even for a small town. The wind carried a strange stillness, and the moon rose over the estate, its pale light spilling across the fountain where Eleanor and Victor had perished. Residents shuttered windows, children were hurried indoors, and the streets emptied of all but the most foolhardy. Clara, meanwhile, remained at the estate, convinced that the answers lay within the walls themselves. She explored the upper floors, noting hidden doors and the faint scent of decay, finding evidence of old family rituals, faded letters, and journals that hinted at obsessive devotion to obscure traditions. In the main hall, she paused before a portrait of a previous Montgomery couple, their faces sharp and forbidding, eyes painted with an intensity that seemed almost alive. The journal she had discovered on a nearby side table described rites performed to bind family fortune, secret ceremonies involving vows exchanged under peculiar astronomical conditions, and warnings of consequences should the rituals be broken. Reading the passages, Clara felt a creeping realization. The siblings' deaths were not mere accident or coincidence. There was a force, whether spiritual, hereditary, or otherwise, that had chosen its victims with precision and cruelty. Hours passed unnoticed, and when she finally descended to the garden, the fountain gleamed faintly under the moonlight, water now strangely reflective, capturing not only her own image but the faint suggestion of something behind her. A breeze stirred, though the air had been still, and Clara froze, her breath catching as a whisper seemed to slide through the shadows. It was a sound she could not place, neither human nor animal, a soft murmur that carried an almost imperceptible promise. The Montgomery story was far from over. The following day, Ventura was shrouded in an uneasy quiet, the kind that makes townsfolk glance over their shoulders and hunch their shoulders instinctively. Clara Winslow remained in the town, determined to document every facet of the Montgomery tragedy. She rented a small room in a boarding house near the outskirts, its windows overlooking a narrow stretch of dusty road leading to the estate. From there, she could watch the house without being noticed, and she spent the morning sketching the grounds, marking doors, windows, and the twisting paths of the overgrown garden. By midday, Sheriff Hargrove had returned to the estate with a small contingent of deputies. Their goal was to catalogue the scene in a more official capacity and, if possible, gather statements from the remaining servants who had not fled Ventura. Manuel, the gardener, reluctantly agreed to guide them through the property, recounting incidents he had observed the night before. He spoke of fleeting shadows, sudden cold spots, and the way the air seemed to thicken whenever Eleanor and Victor were mentioned. His tone was earnest but tinged with fear. Hargrove, practical as ever, listened with skepticism but noted the gardener's tremors. There was, after all, a weight in Manuel's words that could not be dismissed. Clara, hidden behind a cluster of olive trees, observed the proceedings with meticulous attention. She recorded the sheriff's notes, the deputies' movements, and the manner in which the estate seemed almost to respond to their intrusion. Doors that had been closed the previous day were slightly ajar. Curtains moved where no breeze stirred, and in the fountain basin the water shimmered with an unnatural clarity. She scribbled furiously, convinced that these details would be vital to understanding the siblings' deaths. As the afternoon stretched on, one of the deputies called for Hargrove's attention. They had discovered a small, hidden study behind a false panel in the library. The room was dusty and contained a clutter of books, journals, and strange objects. Vials of dried herbs, faded photographs, and parchments inscribed with symbols that Clara recognized from her own research into old European occult practices. Hargrove examined the items with a mix of fascination and unease, while Manuel muttered warnings about meddling with things better left untouched. Clara approached cautiously, revealing herself from the shadows. Hargrove's brow lifted. "You again?" he asked, though there was no real accusation in his tone. Clara introduced herself and explained her intent to document the story in full. Though initially reluctant, Hargrove allowed her to stay, perhaps sensing that she might uncover details he could not. The hidden study became a focal point for their investigation. Clara spent hours poring over the journals, each entry more unsettling than the last. They chronicled decades of Montgomery family rituals, strict adherence to celestial alignments, binding oaths exchanged in secrecy, and warnings against the breach of certain family laws. One passage, dated nearly 50 years prior, spoke directly of siblings in the family line, referencing their union as a final act to seal the house's fortune. The text was cryptic, written in a careful hand, but the implications were unmistakable. By evening, Clara felt a creeping tension in her chest. The estate seemed to pulse with expectation, and shadows lengthened in ways that contradicted the position of the sun. She noticed a figure standing at the top of the main staircase, barely visible, watching her. It was Victor, or at least the image of him, rendered in the moonlight streaming through the dusty windows. She blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only a chill in its absence. Hargrove, noticing her pallor, insisted they leave the estate before nightfall. Manuel accompanied them back down the winding road, muttering that the house never sleeps, and that Clara should be careful not to linger where the dead had walked. Even as they descended, the mansion loomed over them, its walls bright in the dying sunlight but suffused with a sense of waiting. Clara felt the weight of history pressing down, the story of the Montgomery siblings not confined to their deaths, but stretching backward across generations. That night, In the quiet of her boarding house, Clara reviewed her notes. She noted patterns in the deaths of previous family members, cross-referencing them with celestial alignments, historical weather events, and local folklore. A chilling conclusion began to take shape. The Montgomery estate itself was an active agent in the family's demise. Its influence extended beyond mere superstition. It had rules, cycles, and consequences that were enforced with brutal finality. Sleep was fitful. Clara dreamed of the fountain, of Eleanor and Victor rising from the cold stone, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. The shadows of the estate filled her dreams, twisting and turning, waiting for her to awaken. She could hear whispers in the dark, syllables she did not recognize, yet carried the unmistakable weight of command. Observe, document, do not interfere, but do not leave. Morning arrived with the soft haze of early fog rolling off the Ventura hills. Clara packed her notebooks and resolved to return to the estate. Hargrove had agreed to allow her limited access, and Manuel, with reluctance, would accompany her again. The atmosphere on the road to the mansion was heavier than before. The mist clung to trees and walls, obscuring details and creating an illusion of movement where none existed. Every step toward the estate felt like trespassing into a place that had its own consciousness, a place that measured intentions and discerned weakness. As they reached the front gates, Clara could see the fountain in the distance. The water, still as glass, reflected the soft morning light, but she could swear she saw shapes moving beneath the surface, rippling in impossible ways. Victor and Eleanor's forms were no longer static. They shimmered faintly, like images caught between worlds, just out of reach yet unmistakable in their terror. Clara shivered and stepped closer, hand instinctively resting on Manuel's arm. The gardener's grip was firm, guiding her past the fountain toward the main hall, where more answers, and perhaps more horrors, awaited. Inside the Montgomery estate, the air was heavy with dust and memory. Sunlight filtered through tall, narrow windows, illuminating moats that hung suspended like tiny spectres. Clara's footsteps echoed across the marble floor as she followed Manuel through the vast hallways. The house seemed alive, responding to their presence. Floorboards creaked underfoot, yet the sound came from above as well, as though unseen residents mirrored every step. They reached the library, where the hidden study had been discovered the day before. Clara immediately set to work, examining the symbols, the vials, and the faded journals. Hargrove had remained outside at the entrance, claiming he had seen enough, but Clara knew the answers lay within these walls. One journal in particular caught her attention, a leather-bound volume with edges browned by age. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive, and described rituals meant to preserve the Montgomery bloodline while preventing any perceived betrayal of the family's sacred laws. Manuel hovered near the doorway, his eyes flicking toward the ceiling as if expecting it to fall. "They said the house has preferences," he muttered. "It likes things tidy, obedient. It does not forgive foolishness." Clara glanced at him, recognizing that his fear was not superstition alone. He had spent his life working under the house's gaze and carried scars that no one else could see. The journal revealed accounts of past weddings in the Montgomery line, siblings who married outsiders, couples who defied tradition, and those who ignored certain rituals all met untimely ends. Some perished mysteriously in their sleep, others were found in the gardens or along the cliffs. The descriptions were precise, clinical in some passages, almost ritualistic, yet tinged with horror that the writer could not disguise. One particularly chilling passage described twins, several generations prior, who had been found in the family crypt, their expressions frozen in terror, their hands intertwined. Clara turned to the drawings interspersed throughout the text. Diagrams of constellations, tables marking lunar phases, and sketches of the estate itself suggested a methodical correlation between celestial events and the timing of deaths. She realized, with a sinking certainty, that Eleanor and Victor had died on a night precisely calculated to align with one of these cycles. The house, it seemed, acted not only as a vessel but as an instrument of inevitability, enforcing the family's ancient codes with terrifying precision. A sudden chill swept through the room. The candle flames flickered, elongating shadows that crept along the walls like dark fingers. Clara looked up sharply, catching a glimpse of movement in the corner, a figure standing in silence, impossibly tall, watching her from the threshold. Her breath caught. For a moment, she thought she saw Victor's face, pale and anguished, only to have it vanish like smoke. The journal slipped from her fingers to the floor with a hollow thump, and she bent to retrieve it, hands trembling. Manuel whispered urgently, "You shouldn't linger. Not after sundown. The house. It notices." But Clara shook her head. She had come too far to retreat. Every instinct told her this investigation was no longer just about documentation. It was a confrontation with forces older and more powerful than she could yet comprehend. Hours passed as she cross-referenced the journal with her sketches of the estate. There were hidden doors and passages, secret chambers beneath the floorboards, and alcoves behind walls where the light never reached. Each space seemed to hold artifacts, personal belongings, faded letters, and trinkets imbued with significance only the family understood. Clara could feel the weight of generations pressing down on her, as if each object was a testament, a warning, and a key all at once. As evening descended, the mansion seemed to breathe around her. The chandeliers swung gently, though there was no draught. The shadows lengthened, spreading like liquid ink across the walls. Clara sensed a presence behind her, something moving silently through the library, brushing the air with imperceptible force. She turned, and for a fraction of a second, she saw Eleanor and Victor standing near the hidden study, their faces pale and fixed in the same terror that had claimed them the night before. They did not speak, but their eyes seemed to plead, or warn. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying a faint, almost imperceptible chorus of whispers. Clara strained to catch the words, but they dissolved into the rustle of leaves and the creaking of the estate itself. She realized the house was speaking, in a language older than English, older than the town, and its voice carried with it both memory and intent. By nightfall, Clara had mapped the estate's hidden network of passages and chambers, noting where previous deaths had occurred and where Eleanor and Victor had been found. Manuel remained near the staircase, watching, occasionally muttering about patterns he had seen all his life but had never dared to articulate. Hargrove, reluctant and weary, had departed, leaving Clara alone with the mansion's history and its present. The night deepened, and the moon cast long beams through the library windows. Clara's candle guttered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for matches, and when the flame flickered to life, she saw them again, shadowed figures near the corners, their forms indistinct but unmistakable. Eleanor and Victor, or some echo of them, moved silently, eyes fixed on her, waiting. The air grew colder. The house exhaled, and Clara understood. There was a rhythm to the tragedies, a design, and she had now stepped into its current. Escape was not impossible, but it would require understanding a pattern older than the siblings' deaths, older than the house itself. And the house, it would not allow mistakes. The next morning, Ventura was wrapped in a thin veil of fog, the sun struggling to pierce the mist that clung to the hills. Clara returned to the estate with a singular purpose, to trace the final hours of Eleanor and Victor, to understand exactly how the house had claimed them. Manuel guided her through the main hall, his footsteps soft but deliberate on the worn marble. The air inside was heavy, almost viscous, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and decayed flowers. Every step seemed to awaken the estate, as though the walls themselves recognized her intrusion and measured her resolve. They began in the east wing, where the bedrooms of the siblings had been. Clara examined every detail, the folds of Eleanor's gown still faintly pressed into the rug, Victor's shoes aligned too perfectly by the bedside. There was an unnatural stillness here, a sense that time had slowed to preserve the final moments. She noted faint markings on the walls, scratches that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Manuel shook his head. "The house leaves traces," he said quietly. "It likes to remind you that it was here, that it is watching." Clara's attention shifted to the garden. The fountain, now dry under the weak morning light, seemed less threatening but no less solemn. She crouched beside it, tracing the contours of the stone where Eleanor and Victor had fallen. The impression was precise, almost ceremonial, as though the act of dying had been choreographed by some unseen hand. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, only the stillness of death etched into the marble. She returned to the hidden study, flipping through the journals again, searching for a clue to the mechanism behind the deaths. A passage written in an older hand caught her attention. It described a binding of blood and vow, a ceremony performed under specific celestial conditions. Any disruption of the ritual, the text warned, would result in the immediate and unavoidable punishment of those involved. The language was archaic, but the meaning was clear. Eleanor and Victor's deaths were not mere coincidence. They were the direct consequence of a family law, executed by the house itself. Hours passed, and Clara traced the estate's corridors like a scholar mapping an unknown territory. She discovered doors concealed behind tapestries, staircases leading to basements she had never seen, and chambers lined with personal artifacts of long-dead Montgomery ancestors. Each space carried an echo of past tragedies, toys scattered in rooms long abandoned, letters with smudged ink describing foreboding dreams, and photographs in which eyes seemed unnaturally aware. By late afternoon, she ascended to the attic, following a narrow staircase that creaked ominously beneath her weight. The attic was dark, filled with trunks, faded fabrics, and boxes covered in decades of dust. As she lifted the lid of one chest, a stack of letters fell to the floor. They were written by Eleanor and Victor themselves, penned in the weeks before their wedding. The letters revealed a growing unease, an intuition that something was wrong with the estate, that some invisible hand dictated the boundaries of their lives. Clara read aloud, voice barely a whisper. Eleanor wrote of strange sounds in the hallways, of shadows moving independently of the sun, and of a sense of being followed even when alone. Victor spoke of a compulsion he could not name, a persistent anxiety that the house itself was alive, shaping their fate with every step they took. The words were chilling, and for Clara, they provided a direct connection to the siblings' terror. As twilight approached, Clara prepared to descend, but a sudden noise froze her. From the attic's far corner, a figure emerged, faint, shimmering, indistinct, yet unmistakably human. It was Victor, or at least the ghostly echo of him, his face etched with the same frozen terror she had seen in the fountain. Clara's breath caught, and she took a cautious step backward. The figure extended a hand, not in threat but in silent imploration, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. Manuel, standing at the foot of the stairs, whispered, "They linger where the house calls them, trapped until someone understands." Clara's mind raced. The siblings were not at peace. The estate had not released them, and their deaths were only the surface manifestation of a deeper, cyclical force embedded in the Montgomery bloodline and the estate itself. Night fell fully, and the estate transformed. Moonlight spilled through the windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floors. Clara could hear subtle sounds, creaking floorboards, whispers in the hall, a distant echo of laughter both joyful and cruel. The mansion seemed to pulse in response to her presence, as though it recognized her determination and measured her endurance. In a sudden impulse, Clara descended to the basement, a space she had yet to explore. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron and something else she could not identify. The walls were lined with shelves holding ancient vials, jars of herbs, and containers marked with faded symbols. At the center of the room was a stone altar, stained and worn, yet clearly a place of ritual significance. Clara's heart pounded. She had uncovered the mechanism, the focal point of the Montgomery curse, and now she had to confront it, to document it, and perhaps to survive. The basement was suffocating, shadows pooling into every corner, crawling along the walls as if alive. Clara's candle flickered violently, and the scent of damp stone mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. She approached the stone altar at the center, noting the precise etchings that carved symbols of lineage, fate, and blood into its surface. The markings matched diagrams she had seen in the journals, a map of the Montgomery family's ancestral rites, a chronicle of deaths executed with rigid adherence to celestial cycles. Manuel lingered near the staircase, his face pale and drawn. "It is the heart of the house," he said softly. "Every ritual, every death, it passes through here. You touch it, and it knows you." Clara nodded, though fear coiled tight in her chest. She lifted a piece of parchment from the altar, carefully unrolling it. It was brittle, inscribed with instructions in an archaic hand, directions for a binding of blood, a ceremony meant to preserve the family line while punishing violations. The language was chillingly precise, referencing siblings, vows, and a pattern of deaths that repeated like a clockwork mechanism. Suddenly, a low hum filled the basement. The stone walls seemed to vibrate, and shadows on the floor began to twist unnaturally. Clara instinctively stepped back. There, at the periphery of the candlelight, she saw movement. Eleanor and Victor, or the echoes of them, rising slowly from the floor as though drawn by the altar itself. Their eyes were wide, mouths frozen in silent cries. Clara could feel their terror as if it were her own. "Do not interfere," Manuel whispered, though his voice trembled. "The house. It judges. It punishes mistakes. You observe. You survive." Clara's fingers hovered over the parchment, torn between documenting every detail and the instinct to flee. She realized then that the house did not simply kill. It demanded attention, recognition, and comprehension. It was as much a test as a predator. The siblings drifted closer, their forms shimmering and indistinct, and Clara felt the pull of the estate in every fiber of her being. The air grew colder, carrying whispers in languages she could not recognize, syllables sharp and commanding, forming patterns she could barely comprehend. The journal's warnings became clear. Those who ignored the rules, those who disrespected the rituals, were consumed, not merely physically, but spiritually, their essences absorbed into the estate. Eleanor and Victor's deaths had been swift, but their presence now lingered as proof of the house's relentless will. Clara studied the altar, noting faint stains on its surface. Decades, perhaps centuries of repetition, each mark a record of past adherence or violation. A sudden thought struck her. The siblings' union had been intended to satisfy a law that, if broken, summoned inevitable retribution. Perhaps the house demanded conformity to preserve its lineage, punishing those who deviated. As she examined the altar more closely, she noticed a pattern in the etchings, lines connecting names, dates, and celestial symbols. It formed a map of time, a ledger of generations, and Clara's pulse quickened as she realized she could trace the exact timing of previous deaths. The house operated on cycles, and Eleanor and Victor had fallen precisely at the apex of one. She also saw that the pattern suggested another cycle approaching. The estate's hunger was not satiated. It awaited the next alignment, the next opportunity to enforce its decree. A sudden draught extinguished Clara's candle, plunging the basement into darkness. The siblings' forms solidified slightly, moving closer, their presence oppressive and almost suffocating. She fumbled for matches, and as the flame sparked to life, she saw the altar differently, not just as a relic of ritual, but as the epicenter of the house's consciousness, the anchor of its will. The estate, she realized, was not merely haunted. It was sentient, calculating, and bound by law older than memory. Manuel's hand gripped hers. "We must leave," he urged, voice strained. "Tonight, it will stir more than shadows. It will test you." Clara nodded, heart hammering. She had seen enough to understand that the Montgomery tragedy was not isolated. The house did not forgive curiosity or negligence. It demanded awareness and respect. As they ascended the narrow staircase, the hum of the basement lingered like a heartbeat, resonating through the floors and walls. The house seemed to watch, to measure their intent, to anticipate their thoughts. Every step upward was met with resistance. Floorboards creaked where they should have been silent, doors shifted slightly in their frames, and the air pulsed with the tension of generations. Once in the main hall, Clara paused to glance back. The estate loomed in the dim light, walls stretching impossibly upward, and she could feel the weight of centuries pressing down. Eleanor and Victor's forms had not followed, but their presence lingered, etched into the very air, a warning and a guide. The house had not finished. It would not finish until someone understood its laws and recognized the exactitude with which it claimed its dues. The night settled over Ventura with an oppressive weight, the fog rolling down from the hills in thick, slow-moving blankets. Clara and Manuel moved cautiously through the estate, careful to avoid areas she had yet to fully explore. The main hall stretched endlessly before them, shadows pooling in corners that no light could reach. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, every distant gust of wind through the shutters a signal that the house remained alive and aware. Clara returned to the east wing, drawn inexplicably to the bedrooms of Eleanor and Victor. The air here was colder than the rest of the house, and a faint scent of damp roses lingered. She knelt beside Eleanor's bed, tracing the faint impressions in the rug where the sister had fallen. Victor's bed was no less meticulous, the linens unruffled as though death itself had respected certain formalities. Clara could feel the weight of their final moments, the tension that had gripped their bodies as the house claimed them. She shivered, realizing that these spaces retained not only the memory of death, but the very essence of the siblings' terror. Manuel hesitated near the doorway. "The house watches this room more than any other," he whispered. "It feeds on fear here, and yet it preserves it." Clara nodded silently. She understood that the estate's power was not random. It was deliberate, selective, and terrifyingly precise. She moved to the window, looking out over the gardens, where the fountain had held the bodies. The moonlight glinted off the marble, casting ghostly reflections across the stone path. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in the water's still surface, shimmering shapes that resembled Eleanor and Victor, frozen in a tableau of silent screams. The realization pressed down on her. The estate's influence extended beyond the physical, bending memory, perception, and perhaps even the boundaries between life and death. Determined to document everything, Clara pulled her notebooks from her bag, sketching the rooms, the hallways, and the secret passages she had discovered. Her pen traced the shapes of symbols, the position of the altar, and the connections between rooms, trying to capture the house's logic before it claimed her understanding. As she worked, faint footsteps echoed behind her. She turned swiftly, but the corridor was empty, though the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, as if reacting to her presence. A sudden chill swept the hall. The doors at the far end creaked open slowly, revealing the faint outline of a figure. It was Eleanor, or rather an echo of her form shimmering with unnatural light. Her eyes, wide and haunted, fixed on Clara. The girl's mouth opened in a silent scream, and Clara felt a cold hand of fear grip her heart. Manuel grabbed her arm, steadying her. "Do not speak. Do not touch. Observe only," he whispered urgently. Clara's gaze followed the apparition as it drifted toward the hidden study. She realized then that the spirits of the siblings were drawn to the locus of ritual, bound to the estate in ways that defied reason. The house had not only killed them, it had claimed them, preserving their final fear as a warning to any who might try to unravel its secrets. Compelled by a mix of fear and fascination, Clara approached the hidden study once more. The journals lay scattered across the floor, their pages filled with diagrams and instructions for rituals spanning generations. She traced the symbols with her finger, noting repetitions that corresponded to celestial alignments. The house, it seemed, operated on a rhythm older than the Montgomery line itself, enforcing its own laws with unerring precision. A soft humming began, low at first and then rising in intensity, resonating through the walls and floor. The shadows around her stretched and twisted, forming shapes that were almost human, almost familiar. Clara could feel their gaze upon her, pressing against her mind, testing her resolve. She understood with sudden clarity. The estate's hunger was cyclical, its judgment impartial, and its reach eternal. Hours passed as she worked feverishly, documenting patterns, mapping the estate, and noting the locations of past deaths. Manuel remained vigilant, watching the periphery, occasionally muttering about anomalies he had witnessed over decades of service. The air grew heavier with each passing hour, carrying whispers that seemed to rise from the very walls. Clara could not discern the words, but she understood their intent: observe, comprehend, and survive. As midnight approached, the house seemed to hold its breath. Clara paused at the threshold of the basement staircase, knowing that what awaited below was the heart of the estate's power. The altar, the rituals, the echoes of Eleanor and Victor, all converged in that chamber. The mansion's pulse seemed to quicken, the very walls resonating with anticipation. With Manuel at her side, Clara descended slowly into the darkness, candle held aloft. The air grew colder, heavier, and more suffocating with each step. The altar came into view, its surface etched with generations of history, each mark a testament to the estate's relentless judgment. Eleanor and Victor's forms shimmered nearby, bound eternally to the ritual that had ended their lives. Clara's resolve hardened. She would document this fully, understanding the law that governed the estate, even if it meant placing herself in peril. She had crossed into the realm of the Montgomery curse, and there was no turning back. The house waited, silent yet vigilant, as if measuring her intent, testing her endurance, preparing to judge her as it had judged countless generations before. The basement's air was thick and unyielding, carrying the faint scent of damp stone, iron, and something indefinably ancient. Clara's candle flickered, throwing grotesque shadows that danced across the walls as if alive. She stepped carefully toward the stone altar, each footfall a reminder of the mansion's relentless attention. Manuel's hand remained firm on her shoulder, his eyes darting to every corner as though expecting the walls themselves to shift. The altar was more intricate up close than she had imagined. Etchings traced every generation of the Montgomery family, spiraling outward like the rings of a tree that recorded centuries of secret ceremonies and untimely deaths. Clara traced the names with her finger, each one a silent testament to the estate's authority and precision. Eleanor and Victor's names were recent, fresh, and hauntingly prominent among the centuries-old carvings. Suddenly, the candlelight flickered violently, and a chilling draught swept through the basement. Shadows writhed along the walls, forming distorted figures that resembled long-dead Montgomery ancestors. Clara's heart pounded as whispers rose in a chorus, neither male nor female, syllables fragmented yet urgent. She recognized the cadence of ritual, the rhythm of the house itself speaking through echoes of those who had died within its walls. The siblings' forms materialized again, hovering near the altar, eyes wide, mouths silent. Eleanor reached out with a translucent hand, a gesture that was neither threatening nor welcoming, but insistently urgent. Victor's gaze locked onto Clara's, a plea in their frozen expressions. Witness, comprehend, remember. Clara swallowed her fear, lifting her notebook and recording every detail, sketching their forms and the altar, noting the patterns that had emerged across generations. Manuel's voice broke through the tense silence. "The house does not merely punish," he whispered. "It preserves. It enforces the law of the line. Those who do not obey its cycles, they become echoes. These two are not at rest. They are instruments now." Clara's mind raced. The siblings were alive in some spectral, suspended sense, trapped as guardians and warnings, part of the estate's own mechanism. Their deaths had been a statement, a declaration of adherence to the rules written centuries before. Clara bent over the altar, examining the symbols more closely. They indicated a combination of familial relation, vow, and celestial timing. The house did not act randomly. It followed a rigid protocol. Eleanor and Victor's deaths had coincided with the alignment specified in the journals. Other deaths in the family, she realized, could be retroactively traced to similar alignments. The estate's sentience was methodical, logical in its malevolence, and utterly indifferent to emotion. A sudden low vibration pulsed through the stone floor. Clara froze. The shadows around the altar coalesced, forming shapes that were almost solid. She saw hands, ancient, skeletal, reaching toward the altar, toward her, toward the siblings. The air thickened, constricting her chest, and the whispers swelled into an unintelligible chorus. Manuel grabbed her arm. "It tests you," he said. "It wants to know if you understand. One misstep and—" His voice trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken but palpable. Clara forced herself to breathe steadily, recalling every detail she had recorded. She observed without touching, documented without interfering, and slowly, carefully, she began to recognize the rhythm of the house's judgment. The vibration beneath her feet slowed, the shadows recoiled slightly, and the siblings' forms shimmered with less intensity. The estate was responsive. It acknowledged her awareness, her respect for its rules, her determination to bear witness. Hours passed in this tense equilibrium. Clara sketched every mark, traced every line, and catalogued every anomaly. She realized that the Montgomery estate did not kill arbitrarily. It executed ritual, enforced law, and maintained lineage with a precision that transcended human comprehension. Eleanor and Victor were victims, but they were also custodians now, eternal reminders of the house's authority. When dawn finally broke, a pale light seeped through the basement window, cutting through the shadows. The temperature rose slightly, and the oppressive weight of the estate eased, though not entirely. The siblings' forms dissolved slowly into the corners, leaving only the altar, silent and unyielding, as a testament to the night's events. Clara and Manuel rose carefully, exhausted but resolute. She knew she had glimpsed a system older than memory itself, a mechanism of enforcement and preservation that operated with terrifying exactitude. Above ground, the mansion was quiet. The fog had lifted, leaving the estate gleaming in the early morning sun, yet Clara knew that the house's presence was constant, its attention perpetual. Eleanor and Victor's deaths, she realized, were only a fragment of a pattern, a cycle that would continue as long as the estate existed, as long as the family line persisted. She had witnessed the mechanism, but understanding did not mean control. The house remained sovereign, eternal, and unyielding. The estate was unervingly quiet that afternoon, the sun casting long, warm beams across the cracked stucco and weathered courtyard. Clara remained within the house, determined to uncover any remaining traces of the Montgomery legacy. Manuel guided her through corridors she had yet to explore, narrow passages hidden behind tapestries, staircases leading to forgotten chambers, and doors that groaned as if protesting her intrusion. Each space seemed meticulously preserved, a museum of the family's obsessive rituals and tragedies. In a small chamber at the rear of the estate, Clara discovered remnants of a previous generation's preparations for a wedding. Faded gowns hung alongside dusty tuxedos, their collars stiffened by age. Candles lay unlit in candelabras, and scattered papers hinted at ritual instructions. Clara examined the notes, seeing the same recurring patterns: vows exchanged, celestial alignments observed, and warnings inscribed in delicate handwriting. She traced the similarities to Eleanor and Victor's deaths, confirming that the estate had maintained its cycles for decades, even centuries. The mansion seemed to pulse with expectation as the sun began to set. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, creeping across the floor in sinuous, deliberate motion. Clara noticed a flicker at the edge of her vision, Eleanor and Victor's forms reappearing, spectral and hesitant, hovering near the door. Their eyes locked on hers, a silent insistence that she understand the full scope of the estate's influence. She took a deep breath and followed them, moving deeper into the heart of the house. They led her to a room she had not yet entered, a gallery of family portraits. Each canvas depicted a Montgomery ancestor, faces stern and solemn, eyes painted with unnatural intensity. Clara felt a growing unease, realizing that the estate preserved not only their likeness but their essence, the vigilance of generations bound by ritual. She traced each portrait with her finger, reading inscriptions that detailed lineage, marriage, and untimely death. The repetition of names, dates, and alignments painted a horrifying continuity, a legacy of control exerted by the house itself. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet vibrated softly, a pulse that resonated through the mansion's bones. Shadows coalesced at the corners, forming indistinct shapes that shifted and stretched. Clara turned to Manuel, who stood pale and tense. "It tests your understanding," he whispered. "The house measures intent. Only those who truly perceive its rules can leave unscathed." The siblings' forms drifted closer to the gallery, hovering near the largest portrait of all, a depiction of the original Montgomery couple who had established the family line in Ventura decades earlier. The painting seemed to exude a presence, a force that resonated with the house itself. Clara observed the faint glow of the siblings' forms against the canvas, recognizing that they were tethered to this room, bound eternally to the family's legacy and the estate's will. Clara's gaze fell on a small, weathered box tucked beneath the portrait. Inside were letters and journals detailing warnings, preparations, and ritual observations. One letter, in particular, addressed a pair of siblings approaching their wedding night, cautioning that any deviation from tradition would result in immediate and unavoidable punishment. The handwriting was meticulous, the language precise, and the intent unmistakable. The house's cycles were unyielding, and Eleanor and Victor had paid the ultimate price. As the last light of day faded, the mansion seemed to close in, shadows deepening, and the air thickening with anticipation. The whispers returned, faint at first and then growing, a chorus of voices both human and otherwise, urging Clara to witness, to comprehend, to bear the weight of the knowledge she had uncovered. She felt the house's attention focus upon her, measuring her endurance, evaluating her respect for its laws. Manuel grasped her arm firmly. "We should leave," he said, voice low and urgent. "Tonight, it will stir beyond the shadows. It will reach." Clara nodded, recognizing that she had witnessed only fragments of the estate's power. The cycles, the judgments, and the echoes of Eleanor and Victor were part of a larger system that she could neither halt nor control. All she could do was understand, document, and survive. Together, they descended to the main hall. The chandeliers swayed faintly, though there was no breeze, and the shadows twisted along the walls, following their movements. Clara's notebooks were clutched tightly to her chest, filled with sketches, symbols, and observations. She realized that the Montgomery estate was not merely a place of tragedy. It was a living, calculating entity, enforcing a legacy that extended beyond death, beyond memory, and beyond human comprehension. The night settled fully, and Ventura's hills were cloaked in darkness. The mansion stood silently atop its rise, a sentinel of centuries-old lore, its windows reflecting the moonlight like watchful eyes. Eleanor and Victor's forms lingered, barely perceptible in the hallways, spectral custodians of a system that would never rest. Clara understood then that the estate's story was far from over, that the cycles would continue, and that anyone who sought to witness or understand would be measured, tested, and bound by its unyielding will. The final night in the Montgomery estate descended like a heavy curtain, the shadows thick and almost tangible. Clara and Manuel moved carefully through the main hall, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The mansion seemed to hum softly, a vibration that resonated through the walls, floors, and ceiling. Every inch of the house was attuned to their presence, observing, judging, and cataloguing. Eleanor and Victor's ghostly forms appeared intermittently, hovering near doorways, behind pillars, and at the edges of the staircase, their eyes wide, their expressions frozen in silent terror. Clara returned to the hidden study for the last time, determined to consolidate her notes. The journals, letters, and sketches spanned decades of meticulous record-keeping, detailing the same cyclical patterns that had claimed Eleanor and Victor. Each ritual, each alignment, each vow had been executed with exactitude. The estate's law was absolute. Deviations brought death, obedience granted a temporary reprieve, and understanding was survival. Clara realized that her role was now that of witness, of chronicler, and in some way, participant in the estate system. Manuel guided her toward the basement, where the altar remained central, a focal point of generations of enforcement. The candlelight flickered, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move independently, forming shapes that resembled both ancestors and victims alike. The siblings hovered near the altar, closer than ever, their forms shimmering, caught between worlds, suspended by the house's will. Clara's breath caught. The air was heavy, charged with energy she could not name, a presence that felt ancient and deliberate. She set her notebooks carefully on a side table and began a final survey of the altar. The etched symbols formed patterns she had not noticed before, interlocking cycles of bloodlines, celestial alignments, and ritual actions that created a lattice of inevitability. Eleanor and Victor's deaths were a link in that chain, and Clara now understood the full scope. The house's reach was limitless, its judgment precise, and its persistence unending. The estate was a living repository of law and consequence, and its echoes, the trapped spirits, were the instruments through which it maintained order. A sudden chill swept through the basement. The siblings' forms solidified momentarily, their eyes fixed on Clara. She felt their fear and their insistence simultaneously. Bear witness, remember, comprehend. Manuel grasped her arm tightly, whispering, "It will test you tonight. Observe. Do not interfere. Do not falter." Clara nodded, heart hammering, understanding that she was now part of the estate's ritual in a way the journals could not fully describe. The house pulsed around her, a living organism of stone, shadow, and memory. Whispers rose from the walls, incoherent but compelling, forming patterns in her mind, conveying the rules of enforcement. Bloodlines preserved, vows honored, deviations punished. The sibling spirits drifted closer to the altar, their hands almost touching, a reminder of the union that the estate had dictated and claimed. Clara felt the weight of their presence, a gravitational pull that demanded comprehension and respect. Hours passed in tense observation. The estate seemed to slow, measuring her resolve, assessing her recognition of its rules. She documented every detail, the patterns, the alignments, the echoes of past tragedies. Every mark on the altar, every movement of the shadows, every flicker of the candlelight was recorded meticulously. She realized with certainty that she had glimpsed the full extent of the Montgomery curse, a system that transcended mortality, enforcing a rigid, cyclical order across generations. As dawn broke over Ventura, the mansion seemed to settle, the vibrations easing, the shadows withdrawing into corners. Eleanor and Victor's forms faded gradually, leaving only the imprint of their final terror on the stone floors and in Clara's mind. Manuel guided her toward the exit, both of them silent, weighed down by the enormity of what they had witnessed. The estate loomed behind them, unchanging, eternal, and fully aware. Outside, the first rays of sunlight struck the Ventura Hills, illuminating the estate in a serene glow that belied the horrors within. Clara's notebooks were full, her sketches complete, and her mind heavy with understanding. She knew the cycles would continue, that the house's judgment was relentless, and that the Montgomery legacy of precise and inescapable death was unbroken. Eleanor and Victor had perished, but their presence endured, bound eternally to the estate, and the house awaited the next generation to enforce its inexorable law. The mansion stood silently atop the rise, sentinel and judge, observing the valley below. Its windows reflected the sunlight, serene yet watchful, a reminder that the cycles of the Montgomery family, and the house that governed them, would never end. Clara walked away, carrying knowledge of horrors she could not change, the weight of the past pressing on her shoulders, and the certainty that the estate's gaze would follow all who dared to witness its law. The Ventura wind carried only the faintest whisper across the hills, a soft, enduring promise that the house would endure, that its cycles were eternal, and that no observer, no matter how brave or meticulous, could ever alter its judgment. The estate waited. The mansion's shadows stretch endlessly, and the Montgomery curse waits for its next witness. If you crave more stories that linger long after the lights go out, subscribe to Eternal Obsidian. Tell me in the comments, could you survive a night in the estate?